Well, good morning, everybody. How are you? Good morning. It's good to be here. It's good to see all these smiling faces here from all over the place. It's nice. I wish I could have been here yesterday, but I had some happenings at work in the week that unfortunately prevented that. So I'll have to listen to the reporters and see what they have to say. This morning, if you want to start, we're going to be in Matthew 21 for a few minutes. Down about verse 23. So today we're going to talk about the tenants that we see in Matthew 21, that the Lord or a man put in charge of his vineyard. And then from there, we'll look a little bit in the Old Testament about tenants and a vineyard, and some other interesting things that we see that happened in the vineyard with the tower and the living stone. As Rick mentioned, we're going to talk about a living stone as we go through this. And hopefully you'll find it interesting and encouraging. I certainly did when I did this a while ago. It's always fun to look in scriptures and see the neat things that you find. And I think as I go with this, it's important that you remember who it was written to and the times that they lived in. One thing I've learned over the past couple of years is that it's extremely important to remember that the Bible was written thousands of years about things that happened thousands of years ago in ancient cultures. And I know I can't think like someone in ancient culture, but I can read about what they thought and the things that went on. And most of it, a lot of it, is very foreign to us. And so when we read, I think it's really important that we keep those things in mind. And today, hopefully you'll go with me and think about that as we read. But we're going to start with the tenants in Matthew 21, and we'll start in verse 23 and read down through verse 27. It says, "When he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, 'By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?' Jesus said to them, 'I will ask you one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of a human origin?' And they argued with one another. 'If we say from heaven, he will say to us, why then do you not believe him? But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet.' So they answered Jesus, 'We do not know.' And he said to them, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things.'" So Jesus, his authority is questioned, and he's asking them where John came from. Was he from heaven or from earth? And they say they don't know. But he just found one question, and then he refused to answer their question about his authority. And so you think the question that he asked was very direct, because he's trying to get straight to a point. And then he's going to follow up with two parables. And the first parable goes right on, and we'll start right with the next verse, which is verse 28. And so he asks the one question, and they say they don't know, which is kind of a cowardly way out, right? Because they're stuck. They don't know which way they should take this. And they figure the best way to say is they don't know. So in verse 28, he asks another question. And he's going to follow that with a parable and ask them what they think about the parable. "What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first son. 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' He answered, 'I will not.' But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said the same. He answered, 'I go, sir.' But he did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father?" And they said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him, and even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." So this is a stinger for the Pharisees. Because they think that they have all the answers. And they know what's going on, and nobody else does. And so when he tells them about the tax collectors and prostitutes, in my mind I try to think of today. Who is a tax collector and a prostitute today? And I let my imagination go, and I see anybody that I don't agree with. Anybody who doesn't look normal. All kinds of ear piercings, tons of tattoos, pants hanging down, so they have to keep pulling them up when they're walking. All these different things. And you think, I'm going to cross the street because I don't trust that person. Lisa and I just had a conversation with her father, something similar. You can't judge people by the outward appearance. Some of these people are great, loving, everyday people. They just fit a certain style. Well, this is exactly what the tax collectors and the prostitutes were to the Pharisees. They were undesirable. And for Jesus to say that they're going in ahead of you, that was big for them. You know, that wasn't, I don't think they were crushed by it because they don't believe who he is, but it stirred up some emotion and some anger. And one of the things in this passage to me that I focused in on, that kind of clued me in on something, was that he didn't say you weren't going. He said they're going to go ahead of you. And I don't think they're going ahead of him as a position of prominence ahead of him. They're just going ahead because they finally get it. At first they didn't get it. And then they realized, oh yeah, first, no, I'm not going to. And then they thought about it and said, yeah, I'm going to. The others just said, oh yeah, we're already way ahead. But they don't go because they already think they're there. So there's going to be a time when they're going to get there. I think in the Pharisees' mind, they're workers. They're working hard for a kingdom. And in their minds, the other people aren't working. They're doing nothing. All they did was say they would go, and they went. And it counts for something for them. So it's a parable of judgment. John refers to the workers as the Jews. So that same group of people is who Jesus is talking to. So there's a little bit that he's got into them, under their skin, you could say. And then secondly, in verse 33 we'll start, he wants to bring it even further in. He says listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it. He dug a wine press in it and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to the tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? And they said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death, and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That this was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in your eyes? Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priest and the Pharisee heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him because they feared the crowds, because they regarded him as a prophet. So they didn't arrest him at the moment because they were afraid of the crowds, just like with the first question. So here, instead of they'll go in ahead of you, now he's telling them that he's going to give it to somebody else because of who they were and what they were doing. They were killing those, or beating those, who were supposed to be coming to collect the harvest. And then finally, when he sends his son, they drag him out and they kill him. And he's not only telling them of a kingdom principle and judgment, he's also telling them this is what is happening right now. And you are the ones who are dragging down and killing. And you are the ones who are deserving, as they said, a wretch, deserving a miserable death. And of course, they think he's regarded as a prophet. Well, they know what happened to the prophets, right? The prophets were all eventually taken out and gotten rid of. So in their minds, this is what they're working towards. Something that's interesting in here, and I looked up a couple things that were kind of neat that we can look at today. So the harvest at the time, I don't know how big the harvest was at that moment in time. It was at least those in Israel, or the Jewish folks, expecting the kingdom that was going to come. But I think the harvest in the future is going to be massive. And I wanted to kind of get an idea of what is this harvest from grapes to make wine with. It takes a ton of grapes, 1 ton. How many pounds is in a ton?
2,000.
To make 2 barrels, just over 2 barrels of wine. That's 60 gallons per barrel, 300 bottles per barrel. That's a lot of wine, right? Now, I don't know how big this vineyard is, but if you take an acre of a vineyard, you can get between, this is a huge difference, 2 tons to 10 tons. It probably depends on the season, the weather, maybe the kind of grapes. If you're growing cheap grapes, you can make a lot of cheap wine. If you're growing expensive grapes, champagne grapes maybe, they're little teeny things, they are delicious. You can get less. So there you see cost differences. So you could get a lot of wine. I didn't do the math in that part. But I thought of a crop that we see today. Apples. Does everybody like apple cider?
Sure.
Okay. Not talking about hard cider. Just a regular apple cider. The number 1 apple grower in the world is not New York. Although I like to think of it as it, because we have all these special apples here that people from the other parts of the country never eat, like empires and things like that. The number 1 apple grower is Washington State in the world. New York State is number 2 in the country. This year, they're going to be shipping 1.8 million bushels of apples. And they export them all through the U.S. and all through the world. That's a lot of apples. That equals about 5.5 billion pounds of apples. It's hard to fathom, but it's a lot. Out of 5.5 billion pounds of apples, you can make 1.8 billion gallons of cider. That's a lot of cider. So, thinking about in those terms, about a harvest, it's not like I think sometimes you read this, it's a vineyard. You think of ancient times and you see pictures of a vineyard of a few acres attached to someone's house, and that's their livelihood, and it's just this little amount that they're getting. And they're doing just enough for their family, which was common. But I think what Jesus is pointing to is something that's on a massive scale. And when you think of harvest, you think of how many people have to eat and how much food is really grown. It's huge. And if you think about this in terms of people, it's really, really big and really important. So it's very important, I think, that we think of the parables and think about what exactly is he talking about. I don't know if they fathomed the size of the harvest that Jesus was talking about. If the Pharisees fathomed that, or if they even really gave it much thought about how many. I think they just thought of their group, their little group. We are who we are, they are who they are. Some of them will come with us, but the rest of them are going to be way out, never be with us. We are it. But Jesus is thinking much, much bigger. So as we continue looking at this, we're going to turn to Isaiah chapter 5 and look at verses 1 to 7. And also here we're going to find something very similar. There's a large vineyard with a watchtower in it. And of course, the vineyard we're going to equate to Israel. It says, "Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. But he built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there for me to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I do to my vineyard, what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed. It shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed. He expected righteousness, but heard a cry." So he planted grapes because he wanted a crop, produce, so he could make wine. That's what they use grapes for. But it yielded wild grapes. Now, when I first read this, I thought, wild grapes. Why couldn't you make something out of wild grapes? We have wild grapes back by our swamp in our yard. And when we first moved in, before the swamp really became overgrown, I went back and I took a couple of grapes and ate them. They were good. They were a little sour, but they weren't bad. So what is wrong with wild grapes? Well, then I found that wild grapes are often poisonous. So I guess it was lucky for me that I ate wild grapes that were good grapes. You could take the wild grapes and make jams and jellies. You could still make wine and things out of them, but you don't get the quality. They're smaller, they're tougher, they're just not as sweet. So you want the best grapes. And so that's how I've always looked at this. But then I found that there are wild grapes that are poisonous. And I wonder, are these poison grapes? Or are they just not as good grapes? I think they're poison. Because there's something that's happened here, and it's great what's happened here. It's not just, well, they're good, but they're not that great. No, they have become poison. So it needed to be destroyed and gotten rid of. In the middle of this, he built a watchtower. And we see that it seems like often we read about a vineyard in Scripture, and there's a watchtower. The watchtower was built, and that's where the tenants would have lived. In the watchtower. It was common. Even a family plot would have had some type of watchtower in it. And during the harvest time, the family would live in the watchtower instead of in their house. So they could watch the fields, they could see what was going on. If they had people taking care of it, they could watch it. They could see if animals were coming in and do such things to hurt their crops or to eat their crops. And so there was a watchtower in it, and the owner is right there. The owner is not off somewhere. In this particular instance, he's there. He planted it. He's seeing what's happening. He's in among them, watching what's going on. And then finally makes his judgment when he sees that his fields are being overtaken, or his vineyard is being overtaken by poison. The poison that happened from what was supposed to be a pleasant planting, he says there down in verse 7, was there was supposed to be justice. But instead there was bloodshed. Righteousness. But instead he heard cries because of injustices that were happening. At one time I did a lesson about justice, and we looked at different verses where God was judging Israel, Jeremiah and Isaiah, and often we think the judgment is that they had idols, that they turned from God. But Israel was supposed to be a beacon of hope in the world. The world was full of injustice. They were supposed to be just. If you ever heard of the Bible Project, we as a church last year used the Bible Project plan to do the Bible reading through the Bible. Then they have all kinds of neat videos and things that go with it. I think his name is Tim Mackey. If you go on Facebook, there's a Tim Mackey page. There's all kinds of neat stuff on there. It's mostly people that want to ask questions and debate things, but it's kind of neat to watch. He has podcasts, and so one time I was listening to the podcast at home, and one of them is on justice, and it's really, really good. There's like a few of them together that make up one. If you ever have a chance to look at it, take a look at it, and he talks about biblical justice, and it's far different from what we think of as justice. We think of justice as the legal system. God's thinking about justice as, how are you treating other people? When he judged Israel, they were not taking care of the people in their land. They weren't taking care of the poor. They weren't taking care of the widows. They weren't taking care of the homeless. When aliens came through the land, they took advantage of them. All these different things God saw as not the justice he was looking for. Instead, he saw bloodshed. And that's exactly what Israel did. The same things that the other nations were doing. And so they were not being separate. So when he says here, he was expecting justice, got the complete opposite. And that wasn't just an Old Testament principle for God. In Luke 11, we'll turn over there. In verse 42. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and herbs of all kinds and neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. When he's talking about justice and these you should have practiced, he's talking about you should be out taking care of the people around you. But you're not. And that gets them a woe. Just like the people in Isaiah 5. No justice. So Israel doesn't cut it. So he finally sends his son. And his son does exactly what he wants. He shows who you're supposed to be in life.
Sure.
What are you supposed to be? And this is why Paul's always telling us, imitate, 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 imitate in your life what Jesus did on earth. Now obviously I can't do miracles, but there are a lot of things that Jesus did that I can imitate. And if you do, then you're giving exactly what he's looking for. Something that's separate from what you're in. The world system. The world system is not just. But you, or we, or Israel should have been, or should be, a little beacon or light of justice. Something that's refreshing, that others will see and wonder, what is it about this guy? What is it about Israel? He says, doesn't he tell them eventually that other nations are going to see them for him? And they're going to flock and come.
Right.
Because they're going to want to worship. Because it's something different. So he says that, back in Matthew, he said it was taken away. Taken away from them. But we know in Romans 11, eventually, they're going to see it. Remember, he says, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance, those who rejected, be but life from the dead? So eventually, they're going to be there. They're just not there yet, or they weren't there at that point. So I see their judgment just as rejection. Their judgment isn't, or the judgment for anybody who rejects, isn't a final death, torture, hell, anything like that. It's just the point that you rejected, and so now you're going to have to wait out here until you finally figure it out, and you get to come in with everybody else that went ahead. And that's what he's telling them. So that's the tenants. The tenants were given something to watch over. They were given something to care for. Something that a harvest could come out of. That everybody could benefit from. And instead of giving the harvest to who it belonged to, they killed everybody who came to collect it. And then finally the son or the heir of the harvest was killed. But it's important and significant that in each one of those, there's a watchtower. And in Matthew, he talks about the stone. And the stone isn't just in there just to be in there. There's a watchtower. It's made out of stones. And that watchtower has a cornerstone. I think of a tower as round. Yeah, how can it have a cornerstone? It doesn't have a corner. But it doesn't matter. It's the original foundation stone that it's built on. Right? So the watchtower we're going to see is very significant. And the fact that it said that they rejected the stone. They didn't just reject those coming to collect the harvest and the heir. They rejected the whole field. They rejected all of it. They wanted what the heir was supposed to get. The harvest was all the people. The tax collectors. The sinners. They rejected all that. So they wanted to get rid of all of it. And if we go back to Genesis 22, we're not going to turn back there. But in Genesis 22, we have the story of Abraham having to sacrifice his son, or God asking. And the lesson in here, as I'm going to describe to you, is not, it goes beyond a future vision of what God's going to do. Well, that's part of it. it also is going to tell us something in light of ancient people and who Israel was supposed to be, something that God did not want. Abraham came from a culture that was very devoted to the gods that they imagined up, to deities. And their devotion was so intense that it included sacrifices of people. If you do some research, you will find that sacrifice of humans and children was very common in the ancient Near East, where Abraham lived, in the culture he was in. It wasn't uncommon. I don't know their feasts and all their things that they did, their calendar of events, but human sacrifice was often a part of it. There is modern excavations of Ur, where Abraham came from. And some of the excavations have revealed that there may have been as many as 2,000 sacrifices that they found in among some of their temple areas. So it was a common thing. You think of 2,000, well, 2,000 out of millions and millions of people, that doesn't sound like a lot. But I want you to think of Ur. Have you ever watched any of the Discovery shows or anything where they excavate these places? And you look at it and you're like, wow, that's not very big. Because it wasn't. Because when Abraham was alive, there wasn't 10 billion people in the world. Right? There might have been a million, maybe, spread out all over the place. In that little center of Ur, there's probably 10, 20, maybe 1,000 people in that general area. So there wasn't a huge population. So to kill 2,000 people is a lot. It would be like going into the little village of Brockport. I don't know what the population of Brockport is. 10,000? Maybe? It's not a huge village. And just taking 2,000 people out of it to the town center and sacrificing them all. That would be a huge event. Of course, it happened over time. But it's very common. So when God told Abraham to climb the mountain and sacrifice his son, God is thinking he comes from a culture where they kill their children for their gods. I don't know, someone in Abraham's family might have been sacrificed. Someone he knew. And he's saying, will he, do I mean enough to him? Am I equal to or greater than the gods that he followed when he was in the land of the Chaldeans, in Ur? And of course we think, to us today, it's barbaric. God is asking someone to sacrifice their child. Do you ever think that when you read that? I mean, I have in the past read that and thought that. I mean, I knew just from reading and from learning that someday God was going to do that, and here's a picture of what God's going to do. For completely different reasons. But you wonder, did it need to go far for him to ask that? Can you imagine what was going through Abraham's mind? Of course he was disturbed. But how disturbing? It was disturbing because he couldn't have children. And he kept asking. And God made promises to him. And he thought, well, if I do this, then what about my promises? But he trusted. He trusted God enough. Nobody was ever resurrected out of all the people that were sacrificed that Abraham knew in the culture he was in. But he believed that if he did this as God's demand, because that's what he knew, that God still would follow through with the promises. There was something special was going to happen. I don't want to do this, but he's telling me to. And so he goes up to do it, but God stops him. God stops him because it's not what God wants. He was trying to say, the people that are coming out of you, that are going to be a beacon of hope in the world, aren't going to be anything like the other ones. There's going to be no human sacrifice. None. That's not what I want. And I think it's important to remember with Abraham, we're looking at a time when people, I want to say people were still, we say we're still trying to know God, right? There's so much out there. But they were in the infancy of knowing God and who He was. Abraham was. So he's still learning. And God is telling him, this is how different I am. It's how different I'm going to be. And not what you're going to do. So imagine God when He's talking to the Jews or to Israel and Jeremiah, where He's saying, what are you doing? You're doing exactly the opposite of what I wanted. You're showing people exactly the opposite of who I am. You're sacrificing your children by burning them alive to a God who's not even a God. Right? Doesn't He say that? Mm-hmm. There are no gods. That's what He calls them. So the very same thing. So what He was trying to do to them, for them, has totally been missed by them. And you can read of human sacrifice in Scriptures. Ezekiel 16, Ezekiel 20, 2 Kings 6, Isaiah 49, Micah chapter 3, and Zechariah 11. All times where God talks about human sacrifice that Israel was partaking in, just like the other nations did. And human sacrifice went on, not just in the Old Testament times, but it went into the New Testament times. They have found evidence of human sacrifice all over the world that had happened in as recent as a few hundred years of today. So though it's not as common today, at one time in the world it was very commonplace. So God offered life. Everybody else offered death. He offered life as part of who He was to Israel, and they refused. So what does this have to do with a stone? A living stone. He was who Jesus was. The cornerstone that was rejected. So when we read about rejection of a stone, we're going to go back to Job. And actually, you don't have to go there. I'm just going to read it because it's from the Net Bible. So there's chapter 15 of Job. We're talking about wicked and desolation. And he says he lived in ruined towns and houses where no one lives, where they are all ready to crumble into heaps. So a wicked person is living in a village or a town that's destroyed. It's crumbled. But the idea here is not that the wicked one destroyed the town and lived in it. If you look at the Hebrew word in the Net Bible, which is great because they got a lot of notes about translation, it says that the desolate towns were destroyed not by their inhabitants, but by judgment. So when it says he lived in ruined towns, it rightly explains that these are not cities that he, the wicked, has destroyed, but that were destroyed by a judgment on wickedness. People at that time thought, just like after 9/11 was recent, I remember after 9/11 there were TV preachers that came on and said, this is a judgment. The towers are coming down as a judgment on America because of its wickedness. But that, back then, people would have tried to guard against that by the way they built something. There were curses. They thought every time a natural disaster occurred, just like you hear today. I remember even after the big tsunamis that happened out near India, Polynesia, there was a big, remember? Thousands of people were killed, places were leveled. People were like, it's a judgment of God. Everything to these people in the Old Testament. And I just thought of that. In the Old Testament, they thought everything was a curse. Well, so do we today, right? It's got to be a curse. It has to be a judgment. It couldn't just be the weather, right? It couldn't just be some really evil guys got together and hate us and decided they were going to do something huge to get at us. It has to be God's hand. It has to be in it. And so people in the ancient times, there were all these different gods. And they all did judgment. And their judgment was weather, hail, fire, towns, cities destroyed. Those were their judgments. And they had this idea in their minds that if they did something, as they were building their towns, there would be no curses. They would be able to get rid of the curses. The gods would have favor upon them. And so what they did was they had a ceremonial sacrifice. So they turned to sacrifices. Human sacrifice. It often demanded someone of the firstborn. Sometimes they were killed and buried underneath this cornerstone. We're going to build this grand palace. But to make sure that no curses fall upon it, we're going to sacrifice to a certain deity, and this deity will see over our palace. And then when bad things happen around us and people don't follow or nobody makes the deity happy, he'll have peace on us because we sacrificed before we built. Sometimes they were killed and placed under this stone, and the stone was built on them. I found that sometimes they were buried alive under the stones, sometimes in massive clay jars, and they were given some food and provision, thinking that, this will carry them into their next life, kind of like Egypt, right? Pharaoh dies, they buried him in the pyramids, and they found all these other people that were also buried with him. Sacrifices that would accompany him into the next life with all of his riches and gold and the people he went with. Ultimately, these people would be crushed by the weight of the stone in the earth or suffocated. And this practice was not limited to Old Testament times. In fact, if you look this up, you will see that it was carried out in Rome in the times of Jesus. There were Roman buildings that were places of power, seats of power, where people were sacrificed before it was built, underneath it. It happened in Greece. It has happened even in the 16, 17, 1800s. The British, as they expanded their empire, found that it was even happening then in places like India. I saw, as I was reviewing this, I looked at another place, they found it, a castle or a palace built in Korea, in South Korea, and as they're excavating through it, they found the same thing. Human remains underneath the foundation. So this was very widespread. It was something that had knowledge. People had knowledge of. If you read, we're going to read from Joshua 6:26, but I'm going to read it from the Septuagint. The Septuagint is an amazing book. A lot of it flows the same as the Old Testament, but a lot of it doesn't. And you read when it doesn't, it's supposed to key you into what are they trying to tell me. Hebrew men took the Hebrew language, the form of the Bible, and translated it into something that everybody else at that time, Greeks, the spoken Greek, that was the language, everybody else could read and understand the full meaning behind what was it they were trying to say. And in this particular instance, it's Joshua. It says, "And Joshua adjured them on that day before the Lord, saying," this is after Jericho. The walls come down, Jericho's destroyed. But we know we read about Jericho later on, right? Even in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So Jericho came back. "Cursed be the man who shall build that city. He shall lay the foundation of it in his firstborn, and he shall set up the gates of it in his youngest son. And so did Hosan of Bethel He laid the foundation in Abraham, his firstborn, and set up the gates of it in his youngest surviving son. So he rebuilt Jericho. But in his mind, this is a Jewish man. In his mind, he thought, well, I'm going to rebuild Jericho. Probably for his own personal gain and notoriety. But to make sure that it doesn't fall again, I'm going to sacrifice my son. And I'm going to set up this new city on my son. Now in 1 Kings 16:34 it says, in his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abraham, his firstborn, and set its gates up at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, son of Nun. So it was prophesied that this was going to happen. And it did happen. But a lot of commentators read this as, while they were building the city, some type of disaster happened, and he lost his two sons while they were building the city. But when we read in the Septuagint, we find that it was done in them, or with them. This man sacrificed his two youngest sons, his firstborn, and then the next one after that, to build this city, the modern Jericho. To them, the modern Jericho. Jericho still exists today, right?
Yeah.
It must be that the sacrifice worked. Because Jericho's still standing, right? So they were not lost through some mishap, they were sacrificed to overcome any possible curses that could have happened. And this occurred by somebody who was an Israelite who should have known that God does not want human sacrifice. He abhors it. But he did it anyways. And so when Jesus uses the cornerstone analogy, it's been rejected. He's the cornerstone. In 1 Peter 2, verses 4 to 6, it says, come to him, a living stone. Paul says the same thing in Romans chapter 12. Living sacrifice. The whole idea there is not just, I'm alive and I'm going to sacrifice my life and use it for God's purposes. Because in Rome, there was still human sacrifice. The whole idea was, God doesn't want human sacrifice. He's asking for you to be a living stone. Though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built up into a spiritual house. Buildings were built on a sacrificed person and built up. And that sacrifice was supposed to make it strong. But you will be strong. Of course, he's talking to Jewish folks here. He says to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in the Scripture, see, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Jesus became the sacrifice.
Yeah.
Some time ago, we were, my dad and I, a couple of people were reading a book, now I can't remember what it was, but it talked about atonement. And I learned, because my interest was piqued, that there are many views on the atonement. One of them is called the nonviolent atonement theory. And in the nonviolent atonement theory, it talks about this very thing. We think, well, the atonement was violent. Well, yes, it was violent. But the whole point was, according to this theory of atonement, not that it's the only one, God is showing the violence of humanity in the death of Christ. And he's saying, this is what you've become. To the point that you have rejected and killed my son, God's son. This is what humanity has become. And it just wasn't a point to what they became. I mean, they were already that. But he's showing them. And he's saying this is not what you're to be. Because we have to look at not just sacrifice, but sacrifice in many terms. How many people, we even say, we just think of the military for a long. They sacrifice themselves for a cause. Right? That's what we say when military people go out and give their lives. We say that about policemen. We say that about someone who saves a drowning person from a river, but themselves end up drowning because they couldn't get to safety in time, but they saved someone. So it's sacrifice that ends up in the death of a person. And that's what God is trying to show. That's not what he wants. I'm not saying that you shouldn't jump into a river and save someone because you might die. Because that's a noble thing to do. But what I'm saying is that he's saying in the grand scope of humanity, he doesn't want death and destruction in order to advance what your ideals are or what you think is right. And in the Old Testament, it happened to be with gods and deities, that they demanded that, and he didn't want that. So he's showing that throughout Scripture. He showed it through Abraham. And he showed it by bringing out this practice of sacrificing people in order to build a building so they wouldn't have any curses against it. So when we talk about the cornerstone, Jesus is the cornerstone upon which we're built. There doesn't need to be anything else. There doesn't need to be any other sacrifices. That was it. And now we build upon him. Living. God was trying to show that all through the Scriptures. And people just didn't get it. His own people didn't get it. They kept going back to, we have to sacrifice. We have to sacrifice. We have to sacrifice to appease the gods. They had a sacrificial system in Israel, but it wasn't people. Right?
Yeah.
In one of the books I read about atonements, they likened it to people come together for a feast. A feast. Think of the temple. They're slaughtering animals. And what happened with the animals? In the majority of the sacrifices, they were eaten. A time with God. A time to be with him. And they ate and celebrated that. And so that is what I got from the Tenants and the watchtower and the significance of the watchtower and how it was built. God is among the harvest, built on his son. And he's looking for someone. It was Israel. Then his son came and solidified the deal. And he's looking for us to be those just people, to show everyone else. He's already done it all.
Yeah.
This is what he has to offer you. And it's life, not death.
Amen.